Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Lapel from New Focus Recordings. I'm here with Alex Sigman. We're going to talk about his fascinating new release, VURT Cycle. And hey, Alex, how's it going?
Hey, how's it
How
going?
are you doing these days? Hanging
All
in?
right, hanging in there.
Good, great. VURT Cycle came out at the end of June, right?
Yeah, I think June 12th
Okay,
was
mid June.
mid-June. Yeah.
And like, so this is your second album on New Focus. The first one, FC Remap.
Yes.
Uh, uh, Also, they're not, there's a lot of differences between these albums, but one of the things when I think about the two of them is the extent to which you have a sort of conceptual underpinning for the project, and it integrates all the aspects of the different pieces. And like that's one of the things I really enjoy about your work. With FC Remap, there was the future creatures, right? Animation and how that manifested in live performance scores, electronically generated. And in VERT Cycle, it's an inspiration off the science fiction writing of Jeff Noon, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Do
Exactly.
you want to talk a little bit more about like the parameters in Noon's work that got mapped on some of these pieces?
Definitely. So I guess just taking a step back in terms of why I chose this work or the author Noon in general. So um, Several years ago, I was introduced to Jeff Noon's novels, specifically Vert and Pixel Juice. And I've been a fan of the sci-fi genre for a long time. Mostly kind of the classic works, early and mid 20th century novels of writers like Philip K. Dick, for example. Not so much late 20th century works, but I was quite struck by a few aspects of Noon's writing. Um, so first of all, so VURT came out in '93, which was about the time that virtual reality was sort of entering mainstream media as a thing. And so, basically, as someone who's working pretty extensively in various areas of technology, this was a sort of engaging topic for me, and especially to see how um, Jeff Noon, the author, was just imaginatively dealing with the notion of operating in a virtual environment. In this case, the virtual environment is a parallel universe
Yeah.
uh, to which um, a sort of these sort of gang members in this near future dystopian Manchester uh, travel through ingesting hallucinogenic feathers. Um, Details.
No, it's
But
cool.
The aspects of the novel that really stood out to me, besides the obvious theme of the actual and the virtual, uh, were just how sonically evocative a number of his descriptions were of different environments in the novel. And as someone who, in previous works and current works, has been dealing with kind of the relationship of the sounding environment on the artist or composer and how it influences one's sound world. Um, this definitely was a salient point. And further to that, when I was reading the novel, just the narrative seemed kind of cinematic in nature and suggested a sort of soundtrack fairly strongly. So it seemed to lend itself well to an adaptation, musical adaptation of sorts.
Cool.
Um, Thematically, also on a kind of more abstract level, so there's this kind of system of exchange in the VERT world, where if an object is lost in VERT, something of perceived equal value, plus or minus, is returned to the owner. And so the point of departure in the novel is that one of the main characters loses his sister slash lover in the VERT world, and this kind of amorphous alien blob is returned to him, uh, an object of perceived equal value, but
Okay.
so, and so just dealing with this notion of kind of equal or perceived equal valuation of very different kinds of materials.
Uh-huh.
suggested an interesting point. Um, and another aspect, of course, is this the VURT world and also this dystopian Manchester are populated by these various creatures and hybrids thereof. And so this theme of hybridization, just the interactions amongst these characters, this sort of taxonomy, again, suggested a kind of rich starting point for generating materials for the pieces in the cycle.
Great, cool. So actually, we're gonna listen to an excerpt from the first track. I hope I say this right. VURT.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But before we do that, I just want to make sure to give you a chance to acknowledge some of the other people who worked on this record, the artwork and so on and so forth. So go for it.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, special shout out to, so first of all, Achilles Hadjis, who was responsible for the artwork and layout that you see behind both of us.
Yeah.
To the Sound Lab for mastering, and to Dario Giustarini for the production on the final track of the album, DL times XSF.
Cool. So let's listen to a little bit of VURT. Great. So that was the first track off Alex Sigman's VURT cycle. And the title of that track is VURT for violin live electronics. And the violin has a sort of unique, you call it an exciter, right? What does that exactly mean? It's some sort of conduit for processing sound and sending it to the live electronics, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. So most of the pieces on this recording, with the exception of the final track in which there are no electronics, in performance, so one or more instruments are prepared with transducers or sound exciters. So rather than the electronics being projected through a conventional PA system, they're transmitted through these small exciters, which activate resonances in the respective instruments or surfaces to which they're attached. And well, the kind of rationale for this, well, there are two main reasons really for making this decision. One, as pertains to the entire cycle, I was interested in there being this kind of symbiotic relationship between the instruments and the electronics. So the instruments trigger routines in the electronics, but then the electronics influence the acoustic realities of the instruments. So they're sort of tethered together in that way. VURT was the first piece in the cycle that I composed. And I knew that it would be premiered in New York in a venue along a fairly busy street. And so I begin, as you hear in the excerpt, I begin the piece with transformed recordings of urban sounds, of traffic noise, and so forth, breaking glass, and so forth. And this was partially a move to absorb kind of the realities of the environment, not only into the piece in the kind of John Cage or Earl Brown way, but actually into the instrument itself. And so rather than denying the fact that there was this kind of setting and viewing outside sources as a kind of interference, I chose to integrate that element into the piece.
Yeah.
Uh, but it also pertains, of course, to the kind of urban / industrial settings described by described by Noon in VURT.
Right. Yeah. One of the, I mean, since this track also opens the album, one of the things I really liked about that is you sort of turn on the first track and it's almost like you've walked into a different environment, whether or not it's sort of like this factory environment or, as you say, like urban sounds or whatever. It's a great, it's sort of like akin to the several paragraphs of setting that you usually read at the beginning of a novel. Great. So let's move on to the next track, which reflects some of the sort of inspiration of Manchester pop music, right? Its title is Atrocity Exhibition, which is also the title of a Joy Division song.
Yes.
And I was interested, actually. I mean, you sort of referenced that in a few of the pieces more explicitly, and then in your notes as an overall parameter that's being juggled. And Noon, I guess, has this concern in his work, or has references all the time to British pop, right? Like new wave stuff and whatever. When you were actually literally like with a piece like this, where the title is drawn directly from Joy Division, or the Bowie reference in the last piece, what's the process or processes by which some of that musical material might find its way into what you're actually writing?
Yeah, it was kind of an interesting turn of events, because when I was reading VURT, I just had kind of just the impression of sort of Manchester post-punk new wave bands sort of in the background, and also just given the time it was written, the setting, I thought it would be fitting to make use um, uh, of tracks of 80s and early 90s Manchester bands somehow in the piece. So before I even started composing any of the pieces in the cycle, I prepared what I referred to as a Mancunian codex, taking a few tracks and applying processes, sort of remixing and recycling processes, transformations that I normally would in instrumental works or kind of more abstract electroacoustic works, and use this as a kind of stockpile of sample material. It was actually only later that I encountered this interview with Jeff Noon, where he states that this was the music that was indeed influential on VURT and other novels of his. So it's kind of
that's cool.
Coincidence in a way, but
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that was sort of guiding principle for the piece, for the cycle. It's not intended in most cases that one actually perceives these samples. That wasn't really so much the intention,
Sure.
but to use them as a kind of raw material. In certain places, they're a lot more, the references are more apparent than others.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was sort of the genesis of this.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, it reminds me of electroacoustic pieces where everything is sort of manipulated material that's recorded of the instrument that's on stage. But by the time you hear the part, you're not really able to identify, well, that was a violin or that was a guitar. But the point is that there's something that's sort of very, what's the word I'm looking for? Organic about having that the material, the genesis of the material be what it was, whether or not it's sort of immediately apparent to the ear. So, yeah.
It also served as, like in the case of the piece Atrocity Exhibition, as a kind of structural model.
Yeah.
You know, so the introduction, the sort of trance-like introduction, controls things like instrument relations, just the timing of different materials, and so forth. Again, not something that's going to be perceptible to the listener,
Yeah.
but as a kind of external reference that guides certain decision making
Yeah.
in the piece.
Cool. Well, let's take a listen and we'll chat about it a little bit more after the break. So that was Atrocity Exhibition from Alex Sigman's recent release VURT cycle. And this is one of two sort of slightly larger ensemble pieces. I mean, they're not really that big, but they're larger than duos or trios. And in both, it seems like you experiment a lot with dividing the ensembles up and exploring the way those different subsections relate to each other, and maybe like having certain instruments move. Is that an accurate portrayal? Sort of move between the subsections, and is that related at all to the hybridization of species stuff that comes up in the Noon, or am I extrapolating too much?
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's completely on target. So, yeah, both in actually in the three pieces for ensemble on this recording. So I was dealing with this sort of taxonomy of different species in the VURT world and Manchester, and mapping that onto divisions of the ensemble and also interactions amongst these sort of sub-ensembles.
Yeah.
So in the case of Atrocity Exhibition, there are three main categories. So there's the mechanical, represented by the piano, the electronic, represented by electric violin, electric guitar, and bass guitar, and the animal, represented by the horn. Now, at about the time I was composing this, I was also working on a research project at VURT in Paris. Rather strange project dealing with the design and implementation of innovative car alarm systems. And the first stage of this project uh, dealt with the creation of a kind of sound taxonomy and building up a corpus of synthetic car alarm sounds. And so it was dealing with these sort of sound subcategories. And so one category was of animal sounds, another of industrial sounds, mechanic and electronic sounds. So I was sort of applying this taxonomy to how I was, in this case, dividing up these instruments. In the case of the final track on the recording, the characteristics, the definitions of each subgroup are, say, a bit more abstract. Mm-hmm. Since I was working, with primarily acoustic instruments and groups of instruments, whereas in this case, partially because the ensemble was so unusual, I chose these kind of more concrete categories, let's say.
Right. Great, cool. So the next piece that we were going to sample is the Flute and Live Electronics piece, Down the Bottle. And there's a sort of direct reference to a sort of setting in Noon's work that's like a recycling center, right? Bottle Town.
Right.
And you've sort of manifest that that in this piece with a lot of glass sounds uh, and there's an actual sort of sonic technique that you use. You want to talk about that a little bit to get these glass sounds to sort of project or whatever.
Yeah, definitely. So the title "Down the Bottle" refers directly to a chapter of the novel, and the bottle in this case is a district of this dystopian Manchester called Bottle Town, which in former times had been a kind of recycling depot, no longer was. Nonetheless, people would still take their bottles for recycling. So there's this incessant sound of glass breaking, of bottles breaking,
Yeah.
which is described in the novel. Um, and so I incorporated this into the piece by creating this kind of installation, very simple installation, really, just kind of plexiglass panel uh, um, on which glass shards were scattered, and to which sound exciters, transducers, are affixed.
Mm-hmm.
And so the bass flute triggers the electronics, and the electronics then trigger the vibration of these glass shards
Cool.
as part of the installation. So that's mixed into the soundscape.
Great. Let's take a listen to a little bit of Down the Bottle. Great. That was Down the Bottle for Flute and Live Electronics with glass shards. Alex, do you want to add a little bit more about that piece now that we heard a little bit of it?
Yeah, I should just mention that segment represents the most chaotic, the most active part of the piece, and also in which kind of all of the source elements are apparent, are present. So obviously here, the glass installation, and also probably the most explicit uh, references to the Mancunian Codex, to Manchester band tracks. So Love Will Tear Us Apart of Joy Division, There Is Light That Never Goes Out of the Smiths, and a few others.
Cool. I'm going to have to listen back to that track and keep my ears open for those references. That's great. So then the last track we were going to listen to is also the last track on the record, DL times SF. That's the X is representing that sort of time symbol. Is that, or is it just DLXF? DLXSF.
Yeah, it's representing a multiplication.
A multiplication. Right. Great. And this is another larger ensemble piece, as we sort of talked about before. Flute, clarinet, trumpet, electric guitar, bass guitar, percussion, piano, violin, and cello, and it's divided into these subgroups. I was actually wondering, like, I mean, the almost systematic way that you divided this ensemble up, and then the way that you imagined it being sort of fluid, made me think a little bit of like Carter quartets and assigning different characteristics within sort of family systems and stuff. And I was wondering, like, is that something that sort of informed your approach to the ensemble writing here, or is it sort of distinct in that it doesn't seem like you're thinking so much about the individual characters in this sort of personification way as much as it's a sort of objective assessment of instrumental qualities or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of a strategy for dealing with the heterogeneous ensemble and assigning different instruments uh, to groups that have some kind of unifying principle, but which are distinct from each other. Sure, I mean, one could point to Carter, even though from an aesthetic standpoint,
Yeah.
obviously on a different plane.
Yeah, totally.
But I would say, yeah, I mean, you raised an excellent point that in terms of the notion of character in this case, partially because well, the characters in VURT are not human, are android or some blend of android and something else. That character here doesn't really kind of have a necessarily kind of emotional or even, yeah, one could say human connotation, but more just in terms of the it could be something as simple as the register that is occupied, or the uh, um, harmonic rhythm, or some of the temporal transformations that occur, etc. Of course, one can ascribe human characteristics
Yeah.
to, and invariably will,
Yeah. Yeah.
to these subgroups. But there wasn't really kind of a model of taking a sort of dramatis personae and mapping directly onto
Right.
a character in a kind of dramatic sense
Yeah.
directly into an ensemble.
Right. Got it. It's interesting though, I guess if as a listener, if you've been sort of made aware of that kind of approach in different ensemble contexts, and then you read something about sort of grouping an ensemble and subgroups, it's almost like this automatic thing to start to listen for that kind of characterization, even if it's not necessarily, as you say, like uh, the specific goal of that particular piece or whatever. Maybe that's just, I find my ear going sort of seeking that out or something. And there's a pop reference in this one as well in the coda, right? Some sort of referential thing to Bowie, and it was right after he passed away.
Yeah, exactly. So this piece was written largely between January and March of 2016, uh, just following the death of David Bowie. And okay, even though Bowie was not himself from Manchester, was highly influential on Manchester bands
Sure.
of the era, amongst others.
Yeah.
So there are references to Ashes to Ashes of Bowie kind of scattered throughout. But perhaps the most uh, evident, the most concrete connection was kind of treating the final section as a kind of dirge, let's say, a way to end the cycle, but also kind of in reference to this recent at the time event. Yeah. With respect to this piano solo that we'll hear in the clip, it sounds, well, in stark contrast to pretty much anything that came before. Many elements have been there the whole time. So in terms of the harmonic progression, in terms of the the harmonics you hear, they've just been integrated into different sub-ensembles and play a different role. So there's something kind of familiar about this, but also alien at the same time. And again, like I wouldn't expect anyone to pick up on the Ashes to Ashes references. That they're deeply encoded in them. But again, they served as a kind of guide, as a kind of structural model for me when I was composing this.
Yeah, and also a nice tie-in to the extent to which this is framing Noon's world, you know, as you sort of mentioned before. So great. So here is a bit of the last track. Back. That was an excerpt of the last track from Alex Sigman's VURT cycle, DL times SF, and it was performed by Ensemble Modelo 62. Great. Well, this was great. It was as I think I mentioned before, it was great to get to know this record and also to put it in the context of your earlier record, FC Remap, on New Focus, which also had this beautifully integrated conceptual thread running through the record. And it's one of the things I really admire about your work is your ability to keep all these conceptual ideas in the air and infuse the different pieces on an album with those concepts. So thanks again for joining. Is there anything you want to add about the album, or I mean, for everybody out there, it's available on our site, also Bandcamp, and everywhere else where music is sold and not sold. And it was a pleasure putting it out.
Yeah, well, pleasure speaking with you about this. And
Yeah,
yeah,
great. Okay, take care, everybody, and thank you so much, Alex. Bye bye.
thank you. Bye.